Hello and welcome to this edition of World at War. I am your host, Jyotsna Kumar. At least 9 people were killed and 29 injured in a Russian ballistic missile strike on Ukraine's southern city of Kryvyi on 12th of June. Now, not only is Kryvyi Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's hometown, but it was the deadliest Russian attack on Ukraine in weeks. A day earlier, Ukrainian President Zelensky said that Russia had destroyed half of his country's electricity generating capacity since it began pummeling its energy facilities in late March. Amidst this doom and gloom, some much-needed good news came from Puglia in southern Italy, where G7 leaders agreed on a new $50 billion loan for war-ravaged Ukraine using profits from frozen Russian assets. It's definitely a shot in the arm for Ukraine, but will it be enough in countering Russia? Our next report brings you the details.
In what is being described as a historic and potentially game-changing step, the G7 leaders agreed on the 13th of June to use frozen Russian assets to raise $50 billion for Ukraine to help it fight the invading Russian forces.
It is a strong signal that we are sending to Ukraine, that we will support Ukraine in its fight for freedom for as long as it takes. It is also a strong signal to Putin that Putin cannot outlast us. You should keep in mind that there's a European support of 50 billion euros, there's the American support of $60 billion, and now comes on top a G7 package of $50 billion. And the message is also that it's not the European taxpayers that are paying for the damage that Putin is causing with his war of aggression, but it is Putin. Because it is the windfall profits from the immobilized assets in Europe that are serving this $50 billion loan for Ukraine.
Also at the G7 summit, pledging long-term support for Ukraine in its war with Russia, the US President Joe Biden and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky signed a 10-year bilateral security deal, which Kiev hailed as historic. Following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, some $325 billion worth of assets were frozen by the G7, alongside the European Union. That pot of assets is generating about $3 billion a year in interest. Under the G7 plan, that $3 billion sum will be used to pay off the annual interest on the $50 billion loan for the Ukrainians, taken out on the international markets. The money, though, is not likely to arrive before the end of the year, which means it will have little impact on the current course of the war. But it is being viewed as a long-term solution for Ukraine's war effort and revival of its economy. A day after the G7 agreement, Russian President Vladimir Putin denounced the move as theft and vowed that it would not go unpunished.
The countries of the West have frozen now a part of Russian assets and foreign currency reserves. Now they are thinking about any sort of legal grounds allowing them to finally appropriate them. Despite all the chicanery, theft will certainly remain theft, and it will not go unpunished.
Additionally, on the eve of a peace conference in Switzerland, where Russia has not been invited, Putin laid out a series of conditions for ceasefire and for entering peace talks.
The conditions are very simple. Ukrainian troops must be completely withdrawn from the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. And I draw your attention from the entire territory of these regions, within the administrative borders that existed at the time of their entry into Ukraine. As soon as Kyiv declares that it is ready for such a decision and begins the actual withdrawal of troops from these regions, as well as officially notifies that they abandon plans to join NATO, an order to ceasefire and begin negotiations will immediately follow from our side, literally at the same minute.
Последует приказ прекратить огонь и начать переговоры.
On the other hand, Ukraine urgently needs more weapons, primarily air defense systems, to blunt Russia's missile and drone attacks on its cities and power stations. as well as long-awaited F-16 fighter jets. Power disruptions have become increasingly common since Russia began pummeling Ukraine's energy systems in late March, cutting out half of its generating capacity. Consequently, streets are frequently plunged into darkness. The hum of private generators can be heard again, and people are seen carrying flashlights to get around.
For cooking, we also had to adjust and purchase a small gas camping stove to heat stuff up. This is common. Many Kyiv residents, many Ukrainians deal with shortages in this way. I think our situation is not the worst, but with the baby, it seriously complicates our reality.
Judging by Russia's belligerence, the loan is unlikely to force a Russian U-turn on its war in Ukraine. But the West's decision to punish Russia in this manner surely sends a strong message.
The Union territory of Jammu and Kashmir has been a flashpoint between India and Pakistan for over 7 decades. The Himalayan region has been roiled by militant violence since the start of an anti-Indian insurgency in 1989 that left tens of thousands of civilians, soldiers and rebels dead, although violence recently had tapered off. The troubled region witnessed a spurt in militant attacks beginning on the day a new government under the leadership of Narendra Modi was sworn in. As many as 4 terror attacks in 4 days resulted in the death of at least 12 people, besides injuring dozens, thereby putting the spotlight back on the restive region. Our next report explores more.
मैं नरेंद्र दामोदर दास मोदी ईश्वर की शपथ लेता हूं कि
Barely an hour before Narendra Modi was sworn in as India's Prime Minister for the 3rd consecutive term on the 9th of June, terrorists ambushed a bus carrying Hindu pilgrims in the Riasi district of Jammu and Kashmir. 9 people, including the driver and the conductor, were killed and at least 33 wounded in the firing, which resulted in the bus plunging into a deep gorge.
It's a very unfortunate incident that happened. Initial reports suggest that militants were waiting there in an ambush and they fired on the bus. The bus was moving from Shivkhori towards Katra city. The driver lost control and the bus fell into the deep gorge.
The bus was on its way to the base camp of famous Hindu shrine Mata Vaishno Devi when it came under attack. Reportedly, the militants kept on firing even after the bus fell into the gorge.
Our bus fell into the gorge due to the firing. After tumbling down 5 to 6 times, the bus got stuck on a large rock. Everyone was injured in the fall. Passengers were lying here and there, some unconscious and some thrown out of the bus. Even after the fall, the firing continued for 10 to 15 minutes.
Pakistan backed the Resistance Front, an offshoot of the terror outfit Lashkar-e-Toiba, claimed responsibility for the attack. India designated the Resistance Front as a terrorist organization last year. The terrorist organization was founded in 2019, following the abrogation of Article 370, which granted special status to Jammu and Kashmir. The Jammu and Kashmir police released a sketch of one of the militants and announced a reward of 20 lakh rupees for fruitful information about him. Leaving no stone unturned, the search operation to nab the terrorists has been extended to far-flung areas of the Riasi district, including Arnas and Mahor areas, notorious for providing safe haven to terrorists between 1995 and 2005. As many as 50 people have been detained so far in connection with the terror attack. The mayhem continued a couple of days later, on Tuesday, when overnight gun battles in Kathua killed 2 militants and a paramilitary soldier, besides injuring a civilian and 6 security personnel. The same night, in Doda's tourist spot Chattergala, militants targeted a joint police and army post.
injuring 5 soldiers and a special police officer. Hours later, in the same Doda district's Kota Top area near Gando, a special police officer was injured after a joint team of police and paramilitary forces came under fire from militants. It was the 4th such incident in Jammu since Sunday. On Wednesday, during the search operation in Kathua, the Indian security forces recovered a huge stash of arms, ammunitions, cash and other supplies, and blamed India's arch-rival Pakistan for the recent spurt in terror attacks.
Our hostile neighbor wants to damage our peaceful environment. This infiltration appears to be a fresh one.
The sudden rise in violence is of concern considering the number of local militants was dropping, although 70 to 80 foreign militants are still believed to be active. Also noteworthy is the fact that the recent attacks come on the heels of a large voter turnout, 58.6%, in the recently held parliamentary elections, which is the highest in 35 years. New Delhi has long accused Islamabad of harboring militants and disrupting peace in the region, a charge Pakistan denies. Given the recent spurt in attacks in Jammu and Kashmir immediately after successful elections, Pakistan will find it tough to deny its role as an agent provocateur.
Buenos Aires was rocked by violent clashes between riot police and protesters outside Argentina's National Congress on the 12th of June. As the Argentine lawmakers debated a swathe of liberalizing reforms, hundreds of Argentine riot police fired rubber bullets, tear gas and water cannons at demonstrators in a bid to disperse them. The defiant protesters pelted stones, set cars ablaze and threw Molotov cocktails, fearful that the proposed measures will hurt millions of Argentines. The local media described the scene on Wednesday as resembling a battlefield. The president's office, too, struck a defiant tone, describing the protesters as terrorists attempting to carry out a coup d'etat. Finally, in the early hours of Thursday, Argentine President Javier Milei's controversial economic reform package won Senate approval. Our next report brings you the details.
A debate that instigated a riot as Argentine senators began to debate a controversial economic reform package proposed by the budget-slashing president Javier Milei on Wednesday. Scuffles broke out outside the Congress between the protesters opposing the proposed reforms and the riot police. The angry protesters tried to bypass fences set up to prevent them from reaching the Congress. In no time, the clashes turned violent, with protesters lobbing stones at officers who pepper sprayed them. Reportedly, at least 40 people were treated at the scene after being pepper sprayed. As the shield-bearing officers pushed back the protesters, the angry protesters overturned and set ablaze 2 cars. Nearly 15 protesters were arrested and at least 5 opposition MPs in the crowd were hospitalized. The controversial reforms aimed at bolstering the country's flagging economy include declaring a state of economic emergency, cutting pensions, and diluting labor rights. Leftist political parties, labor unions, social organizations, retirees, and teachers are bitterly opposed to the reforms.
This is a disastrous law for the Argentine people, where there is a labor reform without severance pay, where workers pay the salary tax again, where President Terminator is empowered to take any measure for 1 year, where international corporations are empowered to invest in our country with a 30-year grace period on taxes.
This law attacks all workers in Argentina. I am a retired teacher and I do not want to be the last generation of retirees in my family. I want my sister, who is a doctor, to be able to retire, my niece, who is a student, and my daughters, who are professionals and who will not be able to retire if the pension package passes today.
After hours of debate, the vote was opened. The motion, which was initially tied 36-36 in the Senate, was preliminarily passed after the head of the chamber, Vice President Victoria Villaruel, broke the tie.
For those Argentinians who are suffering, who are waiting, who don't want to see their children leave the country, for those Argentinians who deserve to regain the pride of being Argentine and always thinking of everything for Argentina, I vote yes.
The bill's separate articles were then addressed point by point and approved with modifications in a full vote in the early hours of Thursday. For a final green light, the measure now again moves to the lower house. The highly divisive bill was initially rejected in its original form and only approved with major changes by the lower house in April. Javier Milei, a right-wing economist, came to power in November last year after vowing to take a chainsaw to public spending. He has, since then, cut the cabinet in half, slashed 50,000 public jobs, suspended new public works contracts, and ripped away fuel and transport subsidies. But despite such harsh measures, annual inflation currently is close to 300%, with more than half the Argentines now languishing in poverty. The first 6 months of Milei's tenure haven't resulted in improvement in Argentina's economy, which begs the question, can Milei, a self-declared anarcho-capitalist, solve Argentina's worst economic crisis in 2 decades?
Close to 120 civilians were killed over a fortnight across the troubled province of North Kivu in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Reportedly, Islamic State-linked Allied Democratic forces are to be blamed for the recent spate of attacks. ADF has been present in Democratic Republic of Congo for 3 decades and frequently carries out attacks in the provinces of North Kivu and Ituri against Congolese army and villagers. The Central African nation, rich in valuable mineral resources, has been plagued by 120 rebel groups in its east, fighting with national armed forces for power, land, and mineral resources. The violence has uprooted nearly 7 million people, with aid inaccessible to many of them. Our next report explores more.
Islamic State-linked ADF militia targeted several villages surrounding the city of Beni in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo on the 7th of June, killing at least 41 people. Friday's attacks on the villages of Masala, Mahini and Keme were carried out by armed militants who used guns and machetes to attack residents of the villages in North Kivu province. 9 others were wounded, and a local health center was also set ablaze.
The assailants arrived in the village during the day. They came from the bush where they started killing people before arriving here at the center. When they arrived at the hospital where we were, we heard the crackling of bullets, and that's how we fled.
Red Cross volunteers and village youth searched for bodies following the dastardly attack. Members of the armed forces of the Democratic Republic of Congo, led by Lieutenant Colonel Mag Hasuke, went on a foot patrol on Sunday, urging villagers to remain in their homes. A visibly shaken Maurice, who lost members of his family fleeing the attack, pleaded for protection.
We learned that our fleeing family members were killed along the way. Here we have 2 bodies, a girl and a boy. Look how they were killed. I asked the authorities to continue to protect us because we don't know exactly where we are.
Allegedly, the ADF is responsible for another attack that killed at least 16 people earlier in the week, bringing the total toll in the region to more than 80 since Tuesday. The horror run continued the next week, with ADF rebels killing over 25 people, including 6 women. In the village of Maikengo in Lubero territory on the 12th of June, the ADF, now based in eastern Congo, originated across the border in eastern Uganda in the 1990s. It took up arms against the country's long-serving president, Yoweri Museveni, alleging persecution of Muslims by the Ugandan government. It forged an alliance with the Islamic State about 6 years ago, though analysts are of the opinion that those links are tenuous. Joint military operations by the Ugandan and Congolese forces against the ADF rebels began in 2021, but they have so far failed to put an end to attacks on civilians. Another rebel group, M23, largely dormant for nearly a decade, staged a comeback in late 2021 and has captured large swaths of territory in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo since then. The largely Tutsi rebel group has been linked with the neighboring Rwanda, though Kigali denies the charge. The big question is, can the impoverished nation among the 5 poorest in the world emerge victorious in its battle with insurgency in its east?
And that's all we could pack into this edition of World at War. Thanks for watching.